Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Jesus' ministry during this section, as he approaches Jerusalem, is now returning to this ongoing conflict with the Pharisees. But it's not just conflict, it's really judgment. And Jesus' interaction with them now becomes a fulfillment of some of, or an extension of some of the patterns you see in the Old Testament prophets. Israel is going to be judged for their hardness of heart, their rebellion, and their sin. Which would be particularly striking when you recognize that the Pharisees and Sadducees are religious leaders. They're viewing themselves as very scrupulous in keeping all the details of the law. They're viewing themselves as the good guys. Jesus is stepping forward and saying, no, actually, you are parallel to your fathers, those who killed the prophets. Let's just get a general orientation within the framework and the structure of the other chapters. So we've come down to Jesus' sixth and final sermon. And it is this prophetic kind of Jeremiad, this judgment declared on Israel for their sin and their rebellion. That quality or that structure of Jesus calling down woe on Israel for their sin, really parallel to the prophets, is something that's just evident if you walk right through the structure of his words in chapter 3. Notice this pattern with woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And this pattern continues on very strikingly through this section. Woe to you, blind guides. Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. It's really a constant refrain all the way to the end until Jesus concludes with a cry of sorrow, kind of a what could have been, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I would have gathered you. And all of this very strong language to recall or remind us of the Old Testament, the prophets who spoke of Israel's sin and the judgment that is to come. Now, I'd like to just call out some of these patterns and to recognize these as we go through the section. So starting out with the one I've already mentioned here, the pattern of Jesus calling out woe. And I'd like you to look across the chapter and just see how often this happens. And then we'll recognize this in comparison to some of the Old Testament prophets. So we've already highlighted this, but just to put all of the verses into one, and in most cases, it's not just the woe, but it's scribes and Pharisees, and it's hypocrites. Hypocrites becomes this repeated refrain that is part of describing who they are and part of describing essentially what the problem is or why the judgment is coming. And I mentioned earlier that this is a strong echo of the prophets. It's just interesting to do a search on the word woe. But that's not the only indicator or the only parallel. But if you walk across the prophets, you can see, particularly in Isaiah, but also Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and all the prophets to some extent, you're seeing this repeated kind of concept. And the word woe is just to say judgment is coming. What a grief, what a sadness. And then I included there at the end Matthew. And it's intriguing because I think what you're supposed to get out of this is that Jesus extends the ministry of the prophets. Yea, verily, if you're following the pattern we've seen in Matthew, Jesus fulfills the ministry of the prophets. He is all that the prophets ought to have been. Jesus does everything that they were called to do. Another really interesting pattern like this is to watch the titles that Jesus uses for the Pharisees throughout this chapter. As I've already mentioned, the most common of these is the word hypocrites, and that's because it's part of the refrain itself. But other titles that he uses are descriptions. One of the most common patterns, along with hypocrites, is blind. Blind guides, blind men. Blind guides, blind Pharisee. So the concept of hypocrisy, you're not really true to what you say. Second, you're blind, you don't really see with truth, or you're not an actual guide to truth because you don't understand the truth yourself. And then their destiny, child of hell. A bit later, Jesus will refer to them as whitewashed tombs, something we'll talk about in a bit, and serpents, brood of vipers, something that probably connects them to Satan. And in each one of these cases, then you can see that the gloves are off. Jesus is now speaking sharply, sharp words to condemn these purported teachers of the law. Now, what I'll do is I'd like to go into some of the specific sections in here that might strike us as a little confusing, explain what's going on, and then get the summary, if we're looking at all of these together, to understand the whole big picture idea. And then we'll draw some conclusions from that. So starting first with this, I think it's possibly confusing to us when Jesus refers at the beginning to their phylacteries. And that's a word that we don't commonly use. But he talks about them having fringes and broad phylacteries and doing all of this to be seen by others is his concept. And you can read that in verse 5. They make their phylacteries broad, their fringes long. So what is a phylactery and what is he even discussing? This is something that continues all the way into the present. And it's the reality that people, in a concern, purportedly, to fulfill the Old Testament command that God's word would be right with you all the time, that it would be on your door when you go in and when you enter, that it would be in your home, that it would be right before your face, and that it would be then your constant preoccupation, the law of the Lord. It's based really on a very literal reading of these verses, a sign on your hand, a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth, that you would bind them as a sign on your hand, that they would be as frontlets between your eyes. And if you go back to the picture I showed you just a moment ago, you can see this concept of literally being bound on someone's hand. I mean, it's not just that it's on their hand, but you can see it bound, and in the similar way, the box on his forehead. These are boxes in on the arm. These are containing specific passages of Scripture, several key passages across the Old Testament. And it is this concept, the Word of God or the law, right there upon you as you read and as you pray. Well, I think what would be the concern and what Jesus is confronting with this is that it's not really actually so simple. In other words, this very kind of woodenly literal reading of it, I put it in a box and I stick it there. I put it here in order to fulfill the literal word by word instructions of that passage, misses something more fundamental. And the question and the description there is, it's part of your life. It's all around you. It surrounds you. And the concept of broadening your phylacteries would be the kind of public way of making something very visible, and even to say, well, I've memorized these passages, and so look how broad my phylactery, look what I've accomplished, or even just how careful I am to fulfill every aspect of the law. A bit later, Jesus highlights another way that these Pharisees had stepped around the law. And that is the distinction that if anyone swears by the temple, it's not as significant as swearing by the gold of the temple. Now, I think what we're getting out of this is the notion that there were ways to kind of step around your words. Elsewhere, we're taught, let your yea be yea, or let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Because there's kind of a way of wink, wink, cross your fingers, oh, well, I said it, but I said it not by the gold of the temple, but by the temple. I swore by the altar, not by the gift that is on the altar. And as far as the specifics of why this works and not that works, then there are all kinds of reasoning, logic and syllogisms underneath this. But the basic concept goes, there's just these hairline distinctions, ways of kind of stepping around. And Jesus' answer to them is no. Your word is your word. Speak truth. Again, what we're getting is by finely cutting the distinctions, one is able to avoid the actual intention of the law. the intention of speaking truth. A bit later, Jesus refers to them as whitewashed tombs. You are like whitewashed tombs which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So just so that we recognize what's happening here, yesterday I referred, or in our previous lecture, I referred to Jesus standing on the Mount of Olives looking across, preparing to enter into Jerusalem. Well, the valley that he would go through, coming from Bethphage across to Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom, is actually filled with quite a few graves, and it's a cemetery. And some of that has to do with prophecies that are talking about the Messiah returning, coming to the Mount of Olives. And so the hope then is that by being buried there in the valley, one is in view of his return when he comes, when the resurrection happens. So this valley is full of all of these graves. Well, one of the interesting things about that is then, as you're entering into Jerusalem, you're passing all of them. Some of them quite sophisticated. A few of these have been excavated, and we can see ancient tombs, I mean, basically buildings that are there about just to showcase the honor and the significance of this person or that. And there you could see kind of the palatial kind of dwelling for dead men's bones. I mean, here's the honor. Look at my tombstone. Look at my grave. It's massive. Yeah, but you're dead. Inside are dead men's bones. But there's probably more than that. And as we understand, it seems that one of the concerns would be if you're entering into Jerusalem and you accidentally touch one of these graves, by the different laws of uncleanness and so forth, and their interpretation and tradition around it. By touching one of the graves, you're no longer clean. You're therefore no longer able to enter in and participate in the Passover. And the amount of time it would take you to become clean again is greater than the Passover itself, meaning your entire journey would be a waste. Everything you had done to be there, and you're going to miss that entire year until the next year you're not going to be able to celebrate the Passover. So the implications of accidentally touching a grave could be huge. And one of the ways then that people tried to make this clear as kind of a warning is that coming up on the Passover celebration, apparently many of these graves were literally whitewashed. So painted white, so that anyone walking through knows, aha, that's a grave, step around that one. And it's a way of avoiding ceremonial defilement. Jesus is turning this, however. And these same Pharisees clothed in flowing white robes, and Jesus is saying to them, you yourself are like a grave. I mean, you're so concerned about accidentally touching a grave, lest somehow the uncleanness then make it impossible for you to celebrate the Passover. But the dead men's bones are within you, your heart. You are that grave. And it will not be enough to avoid touching something in order to stay clean. You are yourself unclean. Now, I want to then step out of those specific explanations and let's look at the overall summary of all of the woes that Jesus cries out against the scribes and the Pharisees. And section by section, I've just broken down the issue, but there's also kind of a contrast, something versus something with each one of these points. For instance, in the first category, Jesus talks about obedience, and his question is words versus action. People would talk about obeying the law, but did they actually do it? Well, his argument goes, no, they're really more concerned about the public appearance, not the obedience. In the second instance, converts, making followers, and they go about, he says, seeking a proselyte, and travel over sea and land to make a single proselyte, a single convert. And in fact, what you've drawn him to is to make him a child of hell like yourself. There is no life and there is no personal regeneration, even though you're desperate to go out there and find someone like this. The third category, the temple, and here he's talking about swearing by the gold versus actually swearing by the temple itself. And the trinkets of worship or the details of sacredness, well, I swore by the altar, not by the offering on the altar, versus an actual concern for truth. Tithing. This is where Jesus talks about people tithing dill and mint and cumin. They're tithing their spices. So you buy the tiniest amount of something, and then you go and you take out 10% to make sure you tithed it. And in the process, you forget about what Jesus calls the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, faithfulness. I mean, the heart, the core, the purpose of the law is forgotten, but at least I tithe my 10% out of the tiny little spices that I just bought. Woe, he cries out, for their ceremonial cleanliness, or their concern for outward cleanliness, but forgetting about the heart. Or the prophets talking about condemning the fathers, and they say things like, if we had been alive, we never would have done what our fathers did when they killed the prophets. But they don't listen to the truth right now. And Jesus confesses, no, actually you are the children of the fathers. And the final future destruction, Jerusalem's rebellion versus God's mercy. Jerusalem will be judged for all of the wickedness that has been brought about. Now, this is the judgment or the woe that Jesus cries out against them. I would like to make one point, and then we'll move to our final concern, which is Jesus' identity throughout this passage. But I'd like to point out here Jesus' relationship to the law. We've talked about this multiple times. One could read through this section and say, aha, Jesus then is against scrupulous law keeping. Jesus is opposed to the law. Watch carefully his language. Verse 3. So they, with all their scrupulosity, all of their details, he tells them, so do and observe whatever they tell you. Just not the works that they preach, but do not practice. So do the things that they talk about. I mean, their concern for obeying the law, he actually commends. The concern he has is that they don't actually obey it. Similarly, in verse 23, people that tithe mint and dill and cumin, I mean, kind of the ridiculous picture of this small amount of spice and you're tithing out your 10%. And then he comments, though, these you ought to have done without neglecting the others. In other words, if you're going to tithe out your 10% of your spice, okay. I mean, if you want to be that scrupulous about the tiniest details of the law, good for you. That you're really concerned to obey the law. As long as you obey the whole law. And I think these comments are important for us to recognize Jesus is not presenting himself as a lawbreaker. Jesus does not come to say all of that concern with the law is off, forget it, and you shouldn't have done it. Actually, Jesus' teaching here is keep the whole thing, obey it all. And that leads me now to Jesus' identity, particularly Jesus' contrast to the Pharisees. Remember, we've asked this question multiple times throughout Matthew. Who is Jesus? That question is so critical. Jesus then, even in his rebuke of the Pharisees, is revealing something about his person. And one of the most basic things he reveals here, or what he shows about himself and his character, is that in contrast to the Pharisees, he's humble. Right? Remember the beginning of his woe upon them, that they care more about the public appearances, long tassels and broad phylacteries, and making sure that they have public places where they pray. But watch instead Jesus' pattern with himself. Whoever humbles himself is the greatest. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That's right within the chapter. We're talking about chapter 23. Why then? Because fundamentally the Son of Man himself came not to be served, but to serve. Jesus is the direct opposite of these religious teachers who would offer themselves and their greatness as a way of giving themselves glory. Another pattern that works like this is Jesus' description of himself in relationship to the Father. And this is truly an extraordinary pattern. Notice with me Jesus' reference to one teacher, one Father, one instructor. Now, that's interesting when we start recognizing, however, the parallelism. You are not to be called rabbi, he says, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers. Call no man your father on earth, you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. So really the titles here, rabbi and father and instructor, each one of them in parallel, and in parallel with those, one and one and one. The interesting thing, the striking thing about it here, is that standing in the middle within this pattern, your Father who is in heaven. And clearly that would refer to God. And on either side of it, he talks about you have one teacher. Now, that's ambiguous. It doesn't say who he's referring to. But just after, he refers to one instructor, the Christ. And the phenomenal thing about this is that elsewhere, Jesus accepts the title of teacher and accepts the title of instructor, even though in this place, he's talked about not allowing that kind of title. His assertion being that he is the one who is worthy of this title. And that's strikingly in parallel to the Father who is in heaven, who's worthy of this title. I think the implication of that, putting that together, is to say that Jesus has just claimed a kind of truth-giving power as teacher, as instructor, a kind of authority. Remember Matthew 5, you have heard it said, but I say to you. The kind of statement or the kind of authority that is parallel to God himself. In fact, if I'm using the language here, you have one instructor, the Messiah. You have one teacher. Then it's interesting to me as well to notice another reference in Ecclesiastes. The words of the wise are like goads, like nails firmly fixed. They are given by one shepherd. And this is the concept of one teacher, one guide. Who is that one teacher? Well, Matthew, you have one teacher, the Messiah. All wisdom comes from one source. It comes from God and God alone. Right. The Messiah, Jesus, speaks with that kind of wisdom. What is Jesus then saying about himself? Thirdly, I'd just like you to notice the pattern of Jesus talking about himself as the sender of the prophets and the sender of the wise men. Now, I'll take a second to explain this concept first. So he's talking about the judgment, or one of the many judgments on the nation, for rejecting those that God has sent. And he talks about their pride in saying, we never would have done what our fathers did. We would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets and murdering them. And Jesus answered, no, you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. But if you need any more proof that they are actually of the same ilk, I will send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some of whom you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town. You will do this very thing that you say you would never have done. So that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. This reference is to say the earliest record in the Old Testament of someone murdered for speaking the truth, all the way until the last testimony at the end of the Old Testament of a martyrdom for speaking truth. And it's making the point that the history of the Old Testament is full of this. But Jesus' argument is it's not just going to be the Old Testament. The New Testament also will contain this record. You will murder those I send to you in the future. And the book of Acts shows this very thing, particularly Stephen's murder, right in the early parts of the book of Acts. But there's more. It's intriguing and fascinating to notice the pattern of who sends these prophets. What Jesus just said, I will send you prophets, wise men, and scribes, in a way that's parallel to the prophets of the Old Testament. And Jesus has just claimed then that he is like Yahweh of the Old Testament, the one who sends prophets. And of course, there's even more to the implication, because we've followed across Matthew the pattern that Jesus talks about his death and that they will murder him. Jesus himself is the ultimate prophet, which they reject and murder. Jesus would gather Jerusalem. Yet another just striking and astonishing pattern in terms of his claim over this city and his authority as God himself. And his words here, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that kills the prophets, stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings? You were not willing." Well, that's an echo of Psalm 91, talking about God covering you with his pinions and under his wings giving refuge. So Jesus is fulfilling what God said he would do. And Jesus then speaks to Jerusalem as one who would show mercy, but as one who must eventually bring judgment. And the end of the chapter, I would like to highlight the way that the chapter ends. Jesus says, "I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" That's an echo of Matthew 21, the triumphal entry. "Hosanna," they cry. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And the contrast that Jesus draws here, in fulfillment again of Old Testament prophecy, is to say that if you would accept me, I am to you blessing. But you have rejected, and therefore you will not be blessed. In the future, stretching all the way out into Jesus' future return, there will be a day when every tongue will confess. There will be a day when you yourself will recognize the words of the triumphal entry. For now, though, your rejection has brought you judgment. Just a few conclusions then to wrap up this chapter and lessons to learn from it. First, do not be shocked to discover very religious people who live out the opposite of true religion. So in our own day, people will discredit faith or discredit Christianity because they'll point to someone that they knew who was not consistent and who was not faithful. That's a very old story. And that's not a discredit to faith itself or to the truth itself. It's simply a discredit to that individual. An old pattern is that people right at the center who claim the status of being Christian might be some of the worst. Evaluate each person rather based on the measure of a careful understanding of God's words. I mean, people will find a way even to scrupulously keep some of the details of the truth. But you've got to evaluate based on a truly careful, rich, thick understanding of God's words. Read his word well and know not just the minor details that are easy to fulfill, but the weightier matters of the law that are costly and require true heart transformation. Third, Jesus' judgments are real and serious. You ought to fear the prospect of falling under God's righteous judgment. But finally, Jesus is always a dependable source of truth. In contrast to those who make claims and pretend to be religious, Jesus always speaks truth. And there is a layer of hope at the end of this entire woe. "Woe, woe," he cries out, "upon scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." But coming to the end, he points to his future return. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." There is blessing. There is hope to that person who has a relationship with Jesus Christ and truly follows him. And just like the Old Testament prophets that called out judgment for the future, so often those prophets ended by pointing us to the distant future, where God would victoriously reign and things would be right again. And Jesus here also cries out judgment, many judgments on hypocritical leaders, but at the conclusion of it, hope to anyone who comes in the name of the Lord. If you have this relationship with Jesus, then you come with hope. And there's beautiful confidence in knowing that Jesus speaks truth and that all who follow him will be blessed.